Well, here we are on the second of our series of encouraging design dialogues, and I'm here with Craig Lindell, and we're going to have a conversation about design dialogues and how to encourage them, Craig. And I think more than ever, we need to really dig into design dialogues and how we can set up the circumstances where there's more dialogue and in our society. It's been a traumatic week, and yesterday was a tragic event, which just demonstrates the need for more dialogue.
It certainly does. It certainly does. I sent you an email on the 12 stages of grief. I thought there were five. There are 12,
Okay.
and it opens a channel, I think, to dialogue in an interesting way, because our last conversation was about looking at grief as the origins of so much of the anger and denial, and so the six that are the origins of, I think, the behavior that we have is shock, and then denial, and then anger, and then bargaining, and guilt, and then depression. And what worries me about this moment is that the deeper stage of depression that I think is not recognized here is the plunge into nihilism. And it was addressed by David Brooks on a rising of nihil. I switch between nihilism and nihilism. I'm not sure of the pronunciation. The David Brooks wrote an editorial in the New York Times on nihilism and how it's increasing in young people. I sat in a steam room at the Y yesterday with a fellow who was telling me precisely that, a younger man who can't afford to get into housing and so has a decent job, but can't ever imagine getting into his own home, trying to figure out how to do that. And he's in the I would say the reluctant stage, because he's still got some hope. But those who don't, who plunge into nihilism, are inclined not to go to work at it at all. And when they lose their identity entirely, and I'll focus on this in a second, in the culture, and have no hope, then there's a reference to this. I may have made it last time in Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, when he's talking about the colonized, who are neither native, this is in Algeria, who are neither native nor colonizer, and they're caught in this limbo where they are not respected by either. And I was looking at this in terms of 9/11, which is today, and the history there, which is when I first discovered it. I went looking for a reason why they would fly into trade towers, and the expression was that persecutional delirium and suicidal tendencies mask themselves as terrorism.
So, what is the what can we, having sort of talked about grief, or at least it's sort of begun that inquiry, and your young man you were talking to yesterday, can we sort of talk about some of the conditions that exist that are leading to these feelings and these sense of grief by young people today?
Yes, and I thought I would do that by reading three people quickly. Joanna Macy, from her work. Let's see, I've got it here.
Yeah, on system series and not
This
Buddhism. Was it Buddhism?
that's her origins, but she's edited a book with a fellow named Stephanie, a woman named Stephanie Kaza, called A Wild Love for the World. And in one of her, I find this very interesting. On page 71, she starts just a little story that's 4 pages long, called Thunderclap. And her thunderclap was when she realized that her whole vision of the world, the whole structure of her infrastructure of her reality, collapsed, and that put her into this stage of grief. And then she started reflecting on what we have been doing to the planet in terms of nuclear waste that isn't properly stored and so forth. And she talks about the despair that came from that. And this all goes to why design dialogue and other elements of recovery are important. So this is the last paragraph. The dark passage that had begun over a year before, that I'd suffered in silence, had brought me to the discovery that our despair, when shared, delivers us to a new kind of humanity. It gives us new eyes to be able to look at what is happening in our world together. I knew then that my grief related to the social and cultural collapse, and despair, what she was feeling about the predicament we were in with respect to the planet. I knew then that my grief and despair would be my close companions and gateway to my work for decades to come. In other words, properly metabolized, as I've learned to use the word from working with Copilot, properly metabolized, the grief and the despair become portals for action.
Well, that is sort of an implicit or a natural reaction, isn't it? I mean, isn't that sort of a survival instinct almost
I
that
think
kicks
that's
in?
correct, but we think about it only for the most part, when we're dealing with grief, we think about it in interpersonal or psychological
Of
terms.
course, yeah.
We don't think about it in social,
Collective
cultural,
terms, yes. I mean,
and
that's
civilizational terms, right?
it's not something that it's not an idea that's been applied necessarily to social systems, if I can use the word system, or cultures, or even communities. Although I think it's a collective experience manifests itself that way, and then how the community or the neighborhood or the the state or particular groups respond um, is what we're talking about here.
Yes, and so let me read you at the risk of getting too obsessed here with. Let me read you the last paragraph from William Irwin Thompson's 1990 publication of a book called "At the Edge of History." It's a two books in one. Passages about Earth and at the edge of history. And at the edge of history, he writes, we will have to come right up to the edge to find out where we are and who we are. At the edge of history, history itself can no longer help us, and only myth remains equal to reality. And I think what he's talking about here about myth is how do we construct a future when the past is no longer prologue? What is the story we tell ourselves? And I think that brings us to the public forum we were talking about, a citizens forum, and specifically to design dialogue. Um, what we know, he goes on, is less than what we are. And so the politics of miracle must be unacceptable to our knowledge to be worthy of our being.
Hmm.
Last week we started to talk. I think last week we mentioned that we mentioned Cartesian thought, where the only
Yes,
way to be is to think, and
right.
he's countering that because he's saying thinking is not sufficient. Is
No, of course not.
to make the changes we need that are worthy of our being.
Well, this issue of thinking and the term systems thinking, I think, can be paradoxically counter intuitive in a sense that we need a whole lot more than, can I say, just systems thinking, and that can lead us. It could be perhaps a start, but it doesn't address perhaps the broader philosophical position that I've been looking into in relation to Alfred North Whitehead, and sort of a process and relational position, um, as a way into thinking about what we're doing right now and how we are becoming rather than thinking or being. But this,
You're right on target, Peter, because what we need to do is think in terms of process and instead of transaction.
exactly that. And so the challenge with that is that it is a monumental shift in position or perspective that um, is so different to our life's experiences and the cultures in which we exist, and have been so monetarily and materialistically rewarded because of it, um, creates, I think, so many barriers that we're trying to identify more clearly and help create ways to overcome. Um, Literally at this time, because we're in such a period of disruption.
You're right on target. I hold a university service award from the University of Massachusetts, an alumni service award. I didn't go to the University of Massachusetts, as you know. I went to Bates, and 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 I used to. So my experience there was very frustrating because everything was event driven. Nothing was ever process driven. It was part of the educational system to be be event driven. I pulled together, because they couldn't get together, the intellectual resources to run a conference on water. They wanted to do something in the business school on the conference on the business of water. And I happened to be friendly with the fellow who invented coastal wetland science, and I got him, and his wife, who came to do who was a postdoc out of Woods Hole, and we had a wonderful conference, and everybody admitted it was a wonderful conference. We were talking about sustainability. It was 10 years ago.
All right.
We never did it the following year. I could have gotten them again. We could have expanded it, but no interest because they had done it once.
Well, that's it. You see, I mean, I think there's this very real problem of saying something, having a conference, and putting it on the shelf, and the event's done and the box is ticked, and the behaviors carry on the same way.
And nothing is learned because we don't learn that quickly. When you get something as imaginative as this conference turned out to be, because you had world-class scholars there. We had a couple of other connections, and nobody can absorb that in a given moment. You have to live with it and metabolize it, if you will, digest it, and that's how you learn.
Absolutely, and it's a process itself, and it has to be
Right.
a whole. It has to be a whole person, whole experience that's not only thinking, it's emoting, and it's sensing in multiple ways. And we we were talking about this in the context of agriculture yesterday, about um, trees being sentient beings, and our understanding of how trees can talk to other trees. And this idea is very foreign to a lot of people. They find it kind of out in the woo-woo land, and yet a deeper understanding of the rhizomic characteristics of communication and water as a carrier too of various kinds of signaling. I know we're sort of wandered off a bit from our
No,
focus on grief,
I think
but
I think you're right on track, because if to extend the metaphor, the planet is grieving.
right, exactly. There is an element of exactly that, and I think to address it in those terms gives us at least a language that is different than the traditional language, um, and may be very helpful in seeking solutions, or at least better ways to come to terms with the reality and how to adjust our behaviors and actions
And
in
and I
ways that are more sympathetic.
and I think people like Johanna Macy and Carolyn Merchant, and to go way back, Ian McHarg on Design with Nature, which was written actually before the EPA was founded.
Yeah, that's. I think this whole question of design, you can design with nature, not at it or um, by it, but in some form of symbiotic relation. And another thing I've been looking at is a whole new company out in California called the Geodome, which is Geoship, I should say, which is providing some hope about new kinds of ways of building structures to live in, which are built on a dome and built with new kind of materials that are very much in similar characteristics to bone, our own bone, so that it has a natural characteristic to it, and is a dome and in a circle, because nature doesn't have any straight lines, which we tend to. And I think these elements of this grief on an individual and then collective basis is leading to this. Coming back to your point about nihilism, and it does give us an entree into thinking about how to support individuals and communities who are in this situation, feel this is a situation, and sort of give them some pointers or signposts to perhaps be different or differently perceptive or differently active.
My sense of urgency, which comes from my ADD and impatience in general, was originally expressed in the epilogue to the book that Tom and I wrote called The Coherence Factor. By the way, no one should try and read that. It needs a second edition. But our premise was that we are no longer living in historical time. We are living in geohistorical time, where geological events happen in contemporary historical time. And while politics was a way of dealing with historical issues, no matter how violent, with historical problems, no matter how violent the politics might become, wars and so forth, in essence, we couldn't replace an ecosystem whose species had become extinct, or restore a glacier, and so we have to be in a much more responsive and adaptive mode. We don't have the control over nature that Francis Bacon thought we would get. We are basically subject to it, and so stewardship and the ancient, that comes out of the ancient biblical tradition, is not a sufficient model anymore. And if you'll indulge me a second more, I'd like to just draw this thunder theme that Joanna Macy was talking about in this new book, through William Irwin Thompson in 1990, where the end of this says, "The future is beyond knowing, but the present is beyond belief. We make so much noise with our technology that we cannot discover that the Stargate is in our foreheads. But the time has come. The revelation has already occurred. And the guardian seers have seen the lightning strike the darkness that we call reality." And basically, I've tried to lay out a number of the guardian seers, if you would, in the last session. And now we sleep in the brief interval between the lightning and the thunder. And that, interestingly enough, for what it's worth to the intellectual historians or the idea people, comes from the same metaphor, comes from Nietzsche's Madman, where he pronounces the death of God. He's famous for that. He's also famous for his work on the Twilight of the Idols, and the madman who delivers the message concludes by saying, let's see, I come too early, then he said. I am not yet at the right time. The prodigious event is still on its way and is traveling. It has not yet reached man's ears. Lightning and thunder need time. The light of the stars need time, and deeds need time before they are after they are done, to be seen and heard. The deed is as yet further from them than the furthest star, and yet they have done it. it's a recognition of what's gone on in the civilization, and the it's a prophet. It's a literal projection of the fact that we have done it and we don't yet see it. Um,
But we're
and
feeling it in a sense, perhaps, in that expression from the young man you spoke to yesterday, and other young people. I mean, maybe they may not see it, but there is an intuitive feeling about it.
that's what makes what you're trying to do here so important, because what we're exploring is the dimensions of grief as social and cultural phenomena, and trying to give a language to it that where we can get some coherence around it. Because if we can't get beyond the confusion and the behavior, the shock and the depression and the denial and the anger that are the manifestations of this, and get it to Joanna Macy's point, where grief and what was her other word, where grief and I've forgotten what despair become portals for change, then then we can't get anywhere. So what we're looking for, and I think the reason what you're trying to do in terms of this podcast, is to find the um, the way from the um, manifestations of grief. There are 12 points to grief here. The first six are manifestations of of denial and depression and so forth. And then the seventh is reconstruction, and the eighth is acceptance, and the ninth is hope, and the 10th is forgiveness, and the 11th is meaning making, and the 12th is integration. So what we need, the grief and the despair became portals for possibility, and that's where the issues of journalism as an as an invocation, and a design dialogue, not design dialogue, but a forum, a citizens forum, as convocation, or and then the structured democratic dialogue as a design possibility. You can begin to see the steps on the way out. And what we've learned from the forum, and what we've learned from where the few places where the forum has been tried here in New Bedford, and where design dialogue has been tried, what we learn is you get you get bridging social capital, instead of being locked up in our depression and our despair, and the bonding social capital that reinforces that. I mean, working with Putnam's notion now, you get to the point where you can build the bridging social capital that sets the stage for voluntary associations, learning libraries, new dimensions of possibility that come out of the recovery stage of grief.
So, what we're laying out here is a potential plan to move forward and offer some different experiences at each stage, even to examine the 12 stages that you've presented, and look at the different kinds of forum or experiences or learning spaces or conversational spaces or public forums that are necessary to provide the comfort and support at each stage along the way, and to program that or offer that in an online or physical or a combination of activities and spaces that we might put together in some design and architectural arrangement
I,
to
I,
do this.
exactly. I think what we're talking about is an infrastructure that is not fixed like we think about infrastructure, but roads and sewers and stuff like that. We're talking about an infrastructure for the practice of democratic renewal. And just to make a point on that, I've written that somewhere that democracy, the American the democratic ideal is that it is about the plurality of our people, the the diversity of their experiences, or the diversity of the nature of the diversity that comes with that plurality, the literacy of their learned experiences, and the scope of their creative imaginations, that we restore democracy. And we're going to need all of that dimension, because nature is just that complex. And to narrow down the decision-making process with technologies or autocracies, the nature of the way this society has been trending, and not with the dimensions of who we are, that we are going to integrate with the planet wherever we're living. um, we miss the opportunity that democracy really gives us, and structured democratic dialogue, which is the design dialogue we're talking about, is turning out to be the best way to the most systematic way, actually the most scientific way, and because of the mathematical algorithms behind it, the most efficient way to reach um, communities, to build that bridging capital across the variety of our differences.
Yeah, it's quite the undertaking, as we have talked about for several years now, and I am still challenged to seek ways to bring that forward and make it more operationally available. And I think we're reaching out in our conversation to others who wish to join in this journey and seek ways to present it and make it available. The other thing that comes to mind too is that without it being grounded in a personal experience of the natural environment, it tends to get ungrounded, if I can use that term, or sort of lost in an abstraction. And we've noticed that so many instances that if it's not actually grounded with a real sense of your 2 feet on the grass or the soil or on the edge of the water, there's a certain disconnect with an actual reality. I'm not explaining myself very well, but
Let,
something along those lines.
let me help. I think you're absolutely dead on. And the reason I think I'm here doing what I'm doing and thinking with you is because the most influential writer in my life was introduced to me by my college professor, in 1968, if you want to go back. And it was Lauren Isley's The Firmament of Time. And Lauren Isley was a paleontologist, anthropologist, a scientist by training, an intellectual historian, won the Phi Beta Kappa Award for his publication of Darwin's Century, provost of the University of Pennsylvania, but a poet by nature. And his poetry basically discredited him, ended up with his being discredited as a scientist who did nothing but think. He was way, way, way ahead of his time. And the quote, I don't know if I did it last week, but it's worth doing again, was his recognition, the recognition of Odysseus by his dog Argos when he came home from his 20 years at sea. I think it's about 20 years at sea, after the assault on Troy. And Isley wrote, "The magic that gleams an instant between Argos and Odysseus is both the recognition of diversity and the need for affection across the illusions of form. It is nature's cry to homeless, far-wandering, insatiable man. Do not forget your brethren of the green wood from which you sprang. To do so is to invite disaster." And I'll put a footnote on this for you, Peter, and that is I was talking to someone about trying to get going with journalism and they're trying to do with electronic journalism. And some younger person said to me, "What are you wasting your time for? Why don't you do a podcast?"
Well, that's certainly what we're trying to do here a little bit. And admittedly, we're sitting inside, and maybe we can do a podcast walking in the outside at some point. I've always thought that would be a rather fun idea if we can get the technology to do it, just to ground it. And it's fascinating that you can recall that story there, which is what 3,000 years old, or in thousands of years old, or
Yeah,
um,
yeah. Homer was about 900 or 1,000 BC. Yeah.
right. I know. I was just thinking that is um, incredible, actually.
The heritage we have is well, it's a bit of a passion of mine, and I think I had ADD and a screaming mother, and I think I probably had a photographic memory that got burned out of me, and but that's neither here nor there. One of the pieces I did in terms of research in the last week or so was to look at this notion of grief as a portal, and it took me back to look at Francis Bacon, um, and because Bacon thought that science would be um, the new alternative to Christianity in terms of salvation and redemption. And and this is not me. This is Microsoft's Copilot feeding it back at me, and it does this. Bacon believed that through empirical inquiry and systematic study of nature, humans could regain the dominion over creation that was lost and in the fall. This echoes a kind of theological undertone. Science, in a way, would fulfill the divine intent in Bacon's mind. In the New Atlantis, Bacon imagined. I'll distinguish this in a second. Bacon imagined a utopian institution devoted to scientific research. It's not just a research lab, it's a temple of knowledge, almost priestly in its function. Science here becomes a sacred duty. Knowledge as power and care is the next element of this. Bacon's famous dictum, knowledge is power, wasn't about domination, it was about stewardship. He saw science advanced as a moral imperative to alleviate human suffering and improvement. Now, Bacon was like about 1560 to the early 1600s, and Newton, I think Newton was the late 1500s or the early 1600s, and by a century later, Newton had given us a view of the world that was totally mechanical.
Well, and therein lies the problem.
Exactly.
And therein lies the foundational problem that we're wrestling with. And even the word mechanical and mechanics and then mechanism, we use the word mechanism rather freely and unfortunately freely.
Yeah.
And it leads to some senses there's sort of cause and effect and not non-linear causality, which then Tom
Precisely.
Farley looked at quite much. And I think it's a real challenge to take this on, which I know a number of people are doing in their own ways. But from a broad perspective, um, it's a massive challenge because, as you point out, there's a 450 to 500 year imperative about a worldview that's been developed. I mean, perhaps a little bit more in the Western world, although I'm not sure that you can say that anymore because I think much of Asia is following the same materialistic um, way, even given their philosophical positions, and so I don't think even that difference is helpful. And so how to how to bring about this more organic um, sense of interplay um, is uh, the challenge of the moment, for
Well,
sure.
we have to find the right people. Your background in natural systems and ocean policy and systems, and my background, which is actually business, and more recently the fate of water and what's going on with water, because I have a wastewater business, but or my son now runs it. I don't really do much in it. I do some business development, but I'm basically a hunter of ideas. I'm not a scholar. I had that kind of training at Bates, and we've lost that, because we've lost the liberal arts education, where which I think, if you read Drucker and what it means to be in a knowledge society, we're going to need the people who can span boundaries a little bit that I do. I'm sure there's scholars that'll pick away at me and so forth, but we have to find people with whom this resonates and bring them into this conversation, and that's what I'm trying to do locally, by the way.
Yeah, I think doing things locally is a good place to start. I admit I have not been doing that um, yet, but it's definitely something I'm talking about in another domain in the United Kingdom at the moment, is how to develop some of that capability, particularly to introduce the some of the fundamentals of cybernetics and systems ideas um, in ways that can be beneficial in that regard. But even that is a challenge. So we should outline those steps you talked about, and perhaps develop them a bit more for next week. I think what I would like to do is kind of, from a podcasty point of view, I mean, we're almost talking for 45 minutes here now. So
Yep.
is sort of perhaps think of a few concluding thoughts on this, and look forward to next week. You've given us a number of different commentators or authors or reflective positions to give some consideration on, and perhaps we can begin to think about how to encourage more participation and engagement.
Why don't we start with Peter Drucker? There's a
Okay.
there's a solid, business consultant, social critic, or not
Mm.
necessarily social critic, but social thinker, who I
Yes.
think sets an appropriate platform. And I would move from Drucker's Post-Capitalist Society in 1990. No, I'd start with his Age of Discontinuity,
Right. Exactly.
and then go to Post-Capitalist Society in 1993, and then maybe Richard Norgaard's critique called Development Betrayed, which he wrote in 1994, and then maybe a look at why our norms and values are collapsing around us, which comes from Peter Turchin's book on the Ages of Discord, written in 2016. Why don't we work on that framework?
I think that's a excellent. And I was just going to reinforce the fact that you have one of the things that brought us together was water. Another was the whole topic of systems. I think I met you through the International Society for System Sciences, but also we have a certain pragmatic background of business. I've worked in small business and I've worked in large business. My business experience has been largely in the United States over the last 40 years, with Fortune 500 companies and small consulting groups and small educational businesses, as well as not for profit. So we have a wide range of experiences that is very pragmatic, and to bring to this
I think what we're
idea.
outlining is at root pragmatism that
Yeah,
people will want to dismiss because it sounds esoteric, but it isn't.
yeah, exactly. Well, I think that's an excellent note to end on today, and I'd like to thank you very much again for this time to explore these ideas, and we'll do it again next week.
Next week. Thank you. And um, I'm looking forward to